All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a whole bunch of amazing conversations and amazing talks. Questions, chuck your questions over there in the chat, and I've been compiling them so far. So Martin, do we have a way of like pulling together a few people on a stage, or are we just kind of all in the same Zoom? You're on mute.
Good news, we are all on stage.
All right, there we go. Cool. So I'm just going to throw it out. Keith, Vibo, Ihara, if you wouldn't mind answering. So let's see. Maria had a question. Do you want to ask it directly, Maria, or shall I paraphrase it for you? Oh, you're on mute.
You're unmuted.
Yeah.
Now it works.
Nope, Maria, still on mute, actually.
I am sorry about
There
that.
we go.
If you don't mind, if you have it, if not, I need to scroll it. Here, I found it. So the question is that you mentioned, oh, there it is. Yeah. So it's mentioned that no work can be called. No wonder you gave me the question, because I can't even read it myself. Too. So in the presentation, it's mentioned that no work can be called pure pictogram animation compared to Reagan's, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, Reagan's work. And I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on this and how this work relates or doesn't relate to Paul Roth's work, because he also, as you know, developed films utilizing pictograms with accompanied with the neurons, right? With the neurons.
Yeah, exactly. And that'll be for you, Ihara.
Yes. I think there is no relationship among them. Independently, I think Philip Ragan began to make animation because he tried 1976, around 1976. He tried to make animation by using pictogram. So there is no relationship.
You don't find the relationship. Okay, thank you.
So earlier in the chat, after Ihara's conversation or talk, Keith actually asked if there was a relationship to sequential art as a result of the animation. So comic strips, comic books, and manga, which actually may have some relationship to Vibo's discussion about icons. So Ihara, maybe for you first, do you see a relationship between animated pictographs and eventually comic books and or other forms of animation?
Yes, I think there is a relationship between pictographic design and comic strip, because Rudolf Modeley he tried to make comic strip. I think the late of 1930s and at the beginning of 1940s, he made a lot of comic strip using pictogram. So there is a relationship, I think.
Vibo, any thoughts? Ooh, fancy.
Okay, no, not much thoughts on this. Katsumi did not do much with comics. He might have described an article about history on art, but no, I don't have much thoughts on this.
Keith, what about yourself? You brought up the question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd love to see some of that work, some of the comic strips that were produced. You know, I mean, it's a tricky question because I mean there is sequential art both in Japan and you know the U.S. sort of before pictograms, but you know then the also sort of takes off at the same time as animation, and so less obviously used for education, you know, which I mean the educational sort of statistical purposes of pictograms mostly at this point don't lend themselves very well to exciting comic books, you know. But I just wonder, you know, I was looking at those diagrams from Krampen's book of the sequential. I mean, I was like, this is just comic books, basically. You know, this idea of a sequential narrative being built through successive images. But I don't know. I mean, it's a broader question, I think, about the relationship between pictograms that show movement and other graphic means of doing that, you know?
In my talk tomorrow, there was a group called Graphic Associates that kind of came out of Pictographs Inc. that started doing kind of pictorial diagrams as panel animations. So I think, and also considering Telefact was distributed by the same companies that distributed comic books, I think there's probably the idea of like the Telefact is like an educational comic.
Right.
But a question for all of you really quickly. So all of you talked at some point about the concept of universality, right? Do you think that through animation, through the icons, and through glyphs, that there even is such a possible outcome of making something that's universally understood?
From my side, I don't think so. No, if I take a look at my subject for this lecture, Katsumi, for example, he was a firm believer in visual language, but by that he was more referring to, let's say, Georgie Kapp, Moholy-Nagy, their work on a very perception, psychology-based level, rather than the idea of a truly universal symbol. Katsumi was very explicit in his idea, his drive, that these symbols would come about through internationality. That means more or less a pragmatic approach, and people slowly work towards something that is at that moment acceptable. It's not universal, it's a temporary moment in time. Universal I would see as something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. There are no universals. You know, there is I think, you know, in Modely's writing in the 1970s, he's very clear that the only way this is the widespread acceptance of the kind that they used to call universal is not going to come about through the strength of the designs themselves, but through concerted government kind of legislation, right? Through authorities sort of mandating the use of particular signs. So that's not universal, right? But it's basically, he realizes that nothing is going to happen without sort of political will behind it, however good your signs are. And so, you know, I think it's also telling that, you know, when somebody is looking, you know, they've got a review of Modely's handbook in the late 1970s, and this person says, this is great if you want to see the way that people used to think human beings were, or, you know, whatever. Like it's sort of what was supposed to be universal now becomes a sign of its own times, which I think is also, you know, what Vibo was talking about. Just as a final note, you know, Paul Arthur, toward the end of his career, becomes really interested in universal design, as in like designing for disability. And, you know, there is sort of putting the lie to the sort of like universal subject of 60s humanism, the like communication for all people everywhere. And he was like, that's what we thought we were doing, but we were leaving out this whole swath of the population, you know? So anyway, interesting stuff.
To add a little bit towards the idea of universal, the thing with visual language was the implied connection to the laws of physics, truly universal values, which also translated in more philosophical notions in modern design philosophy around 1900. And yeah, that's not what you have in pictograms. What is being described effectively is really standardized, the idea of standardization, which implies also collaboration, which is one engineering note. And that's the interesting tension always in these discussions, these efforts. tension between, I think, standardization and the universal dreams, the idea that there's a universal value. And there's not such thing, it's always a tension, and that makes the subject so interesting.
So Ihara, do you have any thoughts on this? The universal in nature of the work, specifically for Reagan?
Not universal, I think. It's a little bit, I think, specific to the United States culture, because those days, some studio have service for not only pictorial statistics, but also cartoon. As a business, they it is possible. There is possibility they thought the similar business to use science like pictograms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a certain standardization that happens in Reagan's description of economics, right? Which I think feels like it could be universal, but is, I think you're right, very much tailored for an American or a Canadian audience. So one of our guests, Hannah Piva, wants to ask the next question. You want to ask yours?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks everyone for your presentations. I guess I want to add a dimension to this conversation about universalization and standardization, because I'm noticing this sort of tension between the standardization and the customization or adaptation of these systems. And it seems that while there's a lot of discussion of the kind of aim for a standard system, people are constantly modifying or adjusting or creating a system for a particular instance, whether that's an Olympic event or whatever. So perhaps that kind of informs the discussion about standardization and the universal. I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that sort of tension between adaptation and standardization in these symbol systems.
I mean, I can just go. It's funny for me that Modely, who starts off as essentially taking the isotype method out of Vienna and like making it into this really kind of flexible tool that he uses to build his own kind of business empire. So he's absolutely adapting these sort of Arndt's images from the 1920s. Ends up in this place where he basically decries the fact that people are using symbols however they want, not in the right way. Everybody's making their own version of existing symbols, and he's like, this can't be the way. And so his whole life from like 1964 onward is devoted to making sure that this doesn't happen, and that we accept a small number and we learn how to use them properly, and we don't kind of deviate from them. So in a way, I mean, this is in a sense a kind of authoritarian bent to the utopian dream of universal communication. I think that for him it was really about standardization even more than it was about universals.
Ibo, Ihara, any thoughts? Standardization? Adaptation? Adaptation?
Well, I wouldn't say that the authoritarian bent shows in standardization. Standardization is seen as more like a harmonious process. It's like some kind of learning process. But the funny thing is, of course, that Neurath, his claim to universalism was much stronger than later designers or later systems, particularly because he was a well-known scientist himself, contributing to the idea of positivism, positivist philosophy, but also quite strong in keeping the system in his own hands. He didn't want to standardize, it was his system. So if there's dictatorial bent, it's certainly there in isotype, but much less so in his followers. So perhaps that's also why isotype is so loved, I think, among designers, because it doesn't compromise. In the end, it's really a personal statement of Neurath.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And maybe centralization centralized, authority and oversight is a better way to put it than the authoritarian bent, but this idea of like centers of experts who would determine glyphs and then have the power to sort of make sure that they were used properly,
I think the interesting thing with many of the people we're discussing is that they saw that standardization more in supranational organizations or governments, rather than professional organizations directly having to do with these systems. And that's coming from their own research into transport associations. But something that's also certainly true for the work that Dreyfuss was involved with. He also contributed to the development of standards for car controls, symbols, car symbols. And that's in the end purely a car industry standard. And that's something that you don't see with many of the figures in let's say, pictogram design for designers.
Yeah, I mean, there's something in that their experience with these organizations, like with the UIC or the IATA, or all the things you mentioned, like Ecograda's relationship with these professional organizations in your great article, which basically they gave them advice and then it was totally ignored, right? Yeah.
Well, I'd also argue that the role of adaptation would have happened very freely as these designers who all kind of knew either directly of each other shared ideas. So Ihara shared the concept of a plugger, the character by Philip Reagan. I've seen this kind of 45-degree angled legs all across Modley's work for decades afterwards. Ihara, why? I know that you talked a little bit about plugger, but why did they try to focus on this centralized character as a design leitmotif?
I simply first when I was researching on about Rudolf Modley. Through the survey, I found Ragan's pictograms, and I was attracted his design, but it's far from standardization, but characterization. So his symbol has strong character. It's if we imagine the character is isotype, it's not so ultimately might be boring. His character has strong personality, so it's welcome to Canadian people, I think.
I should add that our houses don't all look like that, Ihara. The Canadian houses are very, very different. If I can just add one thing, I think is missing from this discussion about, sort of creative deviation or whatever is that I think most of these figures also saw that these systems would need to be flexible, right? So there might be standards, but that things would change over time, right? As the shape of actual automobiles changed, you'd need to change the symbol for an automobile. And that new needs would come up and new glyphs would have to be invented, right? So there is, if there's a will to standardization, there's also a kind of will to open-endedness and flexibility here that I think, isn't always kind of noted.
In practice, you see designers adapting standards to their own needs for their own clients according to their own styles. I always think that Otto Eiger's symbols are a great example, because you really pick them from existing standards, but at the same time also try to apply to the main popular standard at that time, the just decided standard for air transport. So most of the symbols are really based on image contents for air transport, but he adapted them in his own style. But he did try to keep up to date with what was happening at that moment. So adaptation is standard in pictogram design, and you can argue that that's the way the pictograms develop. What you see in many of the archives of designers in the 1960s, 1950s, 1970s is that they collect newspaper articles, prints from existing systems. and they reuse them and pick what's needed. And sometimes that's based on legal considerations, and maybe the client is working in a certain industry, and sometimes some more creative decisions. It's a constant play between adaptation and standard and using of standards.
Well, you know, I think there's also just another pretty more obvious intention is that they were all collaborated, right? Philip Reagan and Maudley collaborated regularly. Maudley clearly collaborated with Dreyfuss. And we see a wide variety of just simply people joining in to work on projects. Speaking of which, Valentina put one last question on the chat. Maybe we can talk through this one really quick. This is for you, Vibo. The Olympic pictograms reveal an accurate and very interesting study. I was wondering if the research has gotten a bit lost today. For graphic design projects, it's easy to find and use icons and pictograms found on various online platforms. So the question, do you think the design process and the genius of the designer have been lost, or has the symbology itself been standardized in the modern language?
I think from a student perspective or a graphic designer's perspective, the fun has been lost a bit because it's so easy to find something new on the internet. Why should you start designing something yourself? What strikes me always is that these collections, it's so difficult to assess what's quality and what is useful and what's not. These collections are so large. They have thousands, 10,000, 100,000 of symbols on the same website. I don't think the genius has been lost. It might perhaps more that since the offering is so large, it's just more difficult to recognize genius and to find the genius. So the genius is still there, but we don't see it. It's there.
I think we don't have time sometimes. So maybe there is no time to research, to study it.
And this will become even easier for people in the future because currently many software companies are developing extensive symbol collections that you can put straight into your interfaces and just quite easily in terms of thickness, and are meant to be complete and totally integrated also in terms of typography, of layouts. So it will be easier to choose. You will have less choice. It will be more integrated. Is that a good development? I have my doubts because it still has no indication about how useful these pictograms are.
I want to jump in with on this theme of just having these things ready to hand and easy to use. There's some great letters in the Dreyfuss archive between Dino Lowenstein, who had taken over Pictograph Corp from Maudley, and in the late 60s, Dreyfuss is asking, Paul Clifton wants to get in touch with Dino Lowenstein to use some of the images from the original 1,000 pictographic symbols. And so Maudley contacts him, and his response is hilarious. He's like, Dreyfuss, who is this Dreyfuss guy? I don't know from Dreyfuss. What's he want? And also, Rudy, if I put this stuff in a book, everybody's just going to steal it. That's how this works. So, kind of, not really on board with the whole thing, but this idea, if I put my symbols out there, look, I charge for these things. If I put them out there in a book, everybody's just going to start using them and copying them. So, even in the 60s, people were, there was a sense that it was too easy. Maybe people would just take, rather than thinking or inventing.
But to that end, we don't necessarily see an uptick in animation of, pictographic storytelling, right? We don't see necessarily the continuation of pictorial statistics really past the 50s and 60s in general. That seemed like it was so obvious and easy. Why didn't that continue if it's all right there?
Well, what I'm curious about is what is the advantage of pictorial animation? Why would you do it? What is the advantage over more cartoon style like animation? And that's also what I was wondering about, Ihara, in your conclusion. If you take a look at the future of pictorial animation, why should we do it? What are any ideas about what were the advantages of this type of animation?
So I think it's a logical conclusion of my presentation because in my presentation, IA Richards, the trial is very different from others because it's purely about communication too, as Pictogram as communication too. So if we think about the possibility, Martin Krampen's trial is very near its spirits, I think. So at last, my as a result, I propose my idea. So it's a difficult question, really.
I see. Jason, would you mind if I draw someone else into the discussion outside the panel?
Absolutely. We're all friends here.
Great. Karel, visual instructions. You can also take a look at the earlier line art visual instructions, now moving more towards movies, film.
Absolutely.
Connection. Yeah.
We're moving away from drawn illustrations for instructions into videos and to animated instructions. I'm not sure if there's a direct relation between statistical graphics and then making sure that pictogram symbols, icons are used in instructions. I think there's an idea to use either videos where you can exactly see the hand movements of people putting something together, or mouse movements where you can see the cursor moving over the screen when explaining that. It's an interesting point to have a look at, but I'm not sure if the symbols are used there.
And my presumption would be that if you talk about pictorial statistics or pictorial animations, that supposed neutrality of what you see is an important advantage. The fact that it doesn't communicate much emotion. I taste continuously a tension between expression and geometric shape in the Reagan animations, and I can imagine that in certain that neutrality, that clarity, you can also see that back in illustrations, in visual instructions, also designed to be purposely quite neutral in tone, no superfluous details. So I do see a link there. I still haven't figured out what it exactly is. But
it's an interesting point. I've got to think about it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I think that also, as Neurath brought in with isotype from the beginning, that he created isotypes in the context of advertising, right? And there's plenty of other media going around. As Ihara pointed out, there were information graphics made by Walt Disney and others, right? So maybe they're just larger trends. And I see that Alvaro, who was also one of our joiners today, had mentioned online that a lot of the kind of explainer videos like you see on Vox Media also use a lot of icons, symbols, graphics. Maybe the real kind of quote, so what of the whole situation is that there's just a lot more tools than silent, black and white icons that we're just kind of reshuffling. So I think why don't I go ahead and draw it here.